Welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and today we're going to talk about blurring the line between the Idaho Freedom Foundation and Idaho Freedom Action. Two very different organizations, even though you will find some familiar names and faces that participate in both of them, that they have different missions and different purposes. And for those who are opposed to what they stand for, namely freedom, fiscal responsibility, limited government, etc., it's in their interest to try to blur the line and make you think that there's some impropriety taking place. We're going to set the record straight.
Press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, I welcome you to Nowhere to Hide. You've probably noticed that with the primary election just a few days away, things are starting to get kind of crazy. And I mean, I don't mean that in a, just pejorative sense. I mean, there's some literal craziness on display. And I guess this has to do with the fact that there is power that's at stake. And it's tough. I know the mudslinging makes a lot of people feel like, oh my gosh, I got to take a shower after I go and vote, because the whole political thing just makes me feel unclean. But I want you to understand by the end of this episode of Nowhere to Hide that there are groups out there that are there to inform, and there are groups that are there to advocate. Unfortunately, the line is being blurred between two of those groups, at least in the media's mind, that line is being blurred to where groups that are trying to inform you in the interest of freedom, in the interest of fiscal responsibility, and in the interest of avoiding centrally planned socialist type policies, so that we can turn everybody against them. And if you look at how the legacy media talks, for instance, about the Idaho Freedom Foundation, you'll see that usually if they were gypsies, they'd spit before they said their name, just because they're so biased against them. But it starts with understanding the difference between a 501c3 and 501c4 organization. So a couple of quick graphics here. Thanks to donorbox.org for providing the definitions. Here's the legal definition. A 501c3 nonprofit corporation, or organization rather, is typically created for religious, charitable, educational, scientific, and or educational intent. Now, they're tax exempt. So that means if you donate money to them, that is also, you get a tax write-off for doing so. They conduct research. They're limited to an amount of lobbying, advocacy, or political activity. Donations to 501c3 organizations are tax deductible. Social welfare organizations like churches, cancer research and support groups, women's shelters, and mentoring programs for at-risk youth. These would be examples of 501c3 groups. And this is what the Idaho Freedom Foundation is, a 501c3 organization. Now, 501c4, it seems like kind of a subtle difference, but the definition here is a 501c4 or nonprofit organization is a social welfare group that can advocate for causes and propositions like 501c3s. However, 501c4s can also endorse specific candidates, and that's a big difference. One of the most substantial differences, in fact, between the two. Examples of this status include political action groups to advance reproductive or civil rights, or something even more controversial, freedom, while nonprofit organizations within the status are also tax-exempt. Donations to 501c4 groups are not tax deductible. And here are a couple of graphics to kind of help explain this. Now, yes, the print is small, but it's there to see 501c3 versus 501c4. First of all, in the definition, a 501c3 nonprofit organization is typically created for religious, charitable, educational, scientific, and or educational intent. 501c4 is more of a social welfare group, meaning they can advocate for causes and propositions as well as advocate for specific candidates. There's also charitable status in a 501c3 education-based nonprofits. They're education-based nonprofits that directly impact the target population. 501c4 actually promotes causes for social welfare by advocacy and political lobbying. So again, it seems like a subtle difference, but it's a big difference because they don't want to lose that tax exempt status, and they have very different jobs to do. Next, when it comes to tax exemption, yes, your donations to a 501c3 are tax deductible, but for a 501c4, those donations are not deductible. When it comes to political lobbying, nonprofits in a 501c3 cannot publicize endorsement in favor of or opposition to a political candidate. But a 501c4 can publicize their support for or opposition to a particular candidate. And finally, when it comes to political views, nonprofits under the 501c3 can't share post-partisan political messages to the public. But under a 501c4, nonprofits can share partisan political messages on online channels. There's also the freedom to influence. 501c3s cannot compare an organization's issue position with that of a candidate. In other words, they can't do electioneering. But a 501c4 can compare their issue position with that of a political candidate. Now, the problem here, I think that much of the legacy media has in Idaho is that there is some crossover in terms of the personnel who work for the Idaho Freedom Foundation as well as the Idaho Freedom Action Organization. So I'm just going to introduce you to them and let you see. The accusations are, well, there's dark money flowing into this state. We don't even know who these donors are. And you need to understand that there's a reason for donor privacy for those who are donating to particular organizations. That needs to be kept intact. And if you've ever been doxxed, you understand exactly why that needs to take place. I mean, for crying out loud. You've got the Kansas City Chiefs place kicker just speaking to a Catholic university about being a good Catholic and upholding traditional family values. And no joke, the person in charge of public relations for Kansas City itself doxes the guy. Just so you know, this guy lives in this neighborhood of the city. So it's getting riskier for people to take an advocacy position, or at least it's risky on some sides of the political spectrum. So let's talk about first the Idaho Freedom Foundation. You recognize their logo. Now let's meet some of the people who are behind this logo. First of all, their mission is to defeat Marxism and socialism by building a culture of liberty around America's founding principles so that Idahoans can prosper. Now, I understand there's those who think, well, that sounds like the John Birchers out there chasing the communists off. And yet, if you have been paying attention, you'll know that Marxism and socialism both have found their way into the mainstream, as in into the classrooms, not just in college and university classrooms, but right into your kids' classrooms K through 12. And it's done subtly. Sometimes, you tell them, well, you can't teach critical race theory. Oh, fine, we'll call it social emotional learning instead. But the bottom result and bottom line is it's still Marxist dogma. Everything is a class struggle. There are victims and there are oppressors. And for some reason, they're always trying to tear down all the safeguards that keep limits on the state in the name of we're trying to enact some kind of social justice, which inevitably leads toward totalitarianism. That's another story. So going a little bit deeper here, this is the team from the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And you'll notice there's two names I want you to see particularly. Ron Nate is the president. Fred Birnbaum is the legislative affairs director. Now, they also have jobs within Idaho Freedom Action, but this is the board of directors for IFF or Idaho Freedom Foundation. Again, I'm not going to name off all the names. This is all public knowledge on the idahofreedom.org website. And this is something you can check out for yourself. They also post the Internal Revenue Service's determination letter, which found them to be meeting the requirements of a tax-exempt 501c3 organization. And in accordance with that, there are requirements that they have to post their income tax returns, their Form 990s for 2019, 2020, 2021. They probably have new ones coming up for 2022 and eventually 2023. But notice right here, public statement, the Idaho Freedom Foundation does not endorse candidates for elective office. Now, they also have a habit of not taking media interviews. And sometimes in the media, that's spun as, well, that's because everything's being done in secret. There's a much better reason than that. This is not about some shadowy backroom deal being cooked up. Idaho Freedom Foundation doesn't respond to media inquiries, and they encourage reporters who are seeking comment from foundation employees to draw from their numerous articles, research reports, podcasts, and videos. And they have produced tons of content over the years to back up why they take the stance that they do. Reporters who desire to explain IFF's unique media policy are encouraged to quote the following in full. The Idaho Freedom Foundation has found most of the legacy news media to be agenda-driven propagandists working to shift public opinion toward socialist ideas. The IFF will not help legitimize biased, unfair pseudo-journalism by responding to requests for comment. That may seem like a hard line to draw, but if you have ever done an interview and sat down and talked, for a half hour or so, only to see it edited down into just a few seconds of sound bites that are twisted or taken out of context to benefit the agenda of the person doing the interviewing, you'll understand why this is now a necessity, because there is no such thing as an unbiased media source. There are, by the way, some reporters who are better than others, but many feel like it's their duty, it's their job to push people toward that more socialist line of thinking. So now we talk about Idaho Freedom Action. This is a 501c4 organization, meaning they can endorse particular candidates. From their website, idahofreedomaction.org, Idaho Freedom Action, or IFA, is a 501c4 nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving freedom in the Gem State. Through direct action, IFA supports policies that strengthen free markets, individual liberty, and state sovereignty, and opposes those that would bring Idaho down a path of socialism. Yes, even Republican-flavored socialism. We love our state, and while we welcome anyone who wants to make a positive contribution to our Idaho communities, we're not interested in radically transforming what or who we are to become more like the places our new residents are leaving behind. That's why we are mobilized to fight the big policy battles facing Idaho, from reckless tax and spend proposals to the hostile, woke takeover of education. This also explains why you see so much opposition to any kind of educational choice policies getting through the legislature, or even being heard for that matter. Idaho Freedom Action is the state's premier free market advocacy organization. Armed with the scholarly products of Idaho Freedom Foundation, IFA is fighting every single day to hold accountable politicians who seek to change Idaho in ways that forsake our heritage and undermine our ideals. We believe that with the right ideas and leadership, Idaho can serve as the model for the restoration of American ideals. We know that our state is the free land America once was, and as such, it remains the best hope for returning to our founding principles. And again, they have their Form 990s on display for public review. They're on their website. You can also check out the IRS determination letter declaring them to be a 401c4 organization. Now, look at this. Ronald Nate is also the president of Idaho Freedom Action. Fred Birnbaum is the legislative affairs director. And for those who would read this into, aha, we've got them. Their expertise is in the area of freedom, responsible and limited government, free markets, etc. As long as they are keeping those duties within the allowable guidelines for what each organization is allowed to do, there's no harm in having either one of these gentlemen, who, by the way, are really good guys. They're not reactionaries. When they speak from a factual and actually they keep a sense of humor, which is something you don't see often. Typically, the more woke or the more dedicated a person is to politics, the less sense of humor they have, the less able they are to laugh at themselves or to find anything humorous. It's all about power and that grim, we got to save you from the enemy that we're designating. And if you don't hate the enemy that we hate, well, then you're just a bad person. You're seeing this in spades during this primary election. So two very good individuals here who bring a unique set of skills to two organizations with different missions, but the same goal of freedom. I hope that makes sense. Here are some of the board members from the Idaho Freedom Action organization. Again, this is all public knowledge. It's all right there, and it's there for your, examination. One of the most powerful tools that the Idaho Freedom Foundation produces is the Idaho Freedom Index, which is charting how your legislators voted, as well as scoring the various pieces of legislation as to how well they stack up in terms of, do they increase the scope and size of government? Do they increase the cost of government? Do they increase the intrusion of government into your life? Now, I understand there are some who believe that, well, if it weren't for government, why, nobody would read us a story at bedtime and the sun wouldn't even rise in the morning. That's not how free people think, though. And the people who are accustomed to statism, whether it's Republican-flavored statism or Democrat-flavored statism, seem to operate under the belief that anything that's not under the direct control of the state is by definition out of control. Advocates of freedom, people who've studied their history, know better. That's not the case at all. You want to be free, you've got to limit the influence of government, and that is what these organizations do in their respective ways and within the guidelines that they have to follow in order to maintain their status with the IRS as either a 501c3 or 501c4 organization. Again, I'm not asking you to take my word for this. I'm asking you, if you really seriously have questions about it, if you just want to hate, I'm not going to be able to talk you out of it. If you're serious about finding the truth or finding things out for yourself, go to their websites. You'll find everything is out in the open, and you might even learn a thing or two that will inform you in ways that the legacy media absolutely will not. Something to think about. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
A press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy.